Awesome. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us here today for our panel on colonialism, decolonization, in the context of sexual orientation and gender identity. We are really glad you're able to join us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. My name is Leah Thompson. I'm going to be a moderator for today. I am also one of the Caribbean advocacy officers at Outright International. So a huge welcome to all our panelists, a huge welcome to our guest speaker, Victor Madrigal-Borloz, and a huge welcome to everyone in the audience. Two quick housekeeping notes. We will be collecting questions. Please feel free to use the Q&A button to share questions. If we have time, we will make an attempt to answer a couple of the questions. We may not have time, but we will make every effort to answer a couple of questions before we end. And secondly, we do have Spanish interpretation available. You can access the interpretation by selecting that world globe button at the bottom of your screen, and you'll be able to access Spanish interpretation there. So getting right into the panel, today's event is brought to you by civil society groups like Collectif Arc-en-Ciel, Colombia Diversa, Ecom, ILGA World, Nazariah, Outright International, the Pacific Human Rights Initiative, and Pan-Africa ILGA. As I said, we have an amazing panel as well as a guest speaker, Victor Madrigal-Borloz, the UN independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity. He spoke yesterday at the United Nations General Assembly, where he presented a report on the legacy of colonialism in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity that we want to discuss a little bit today. That discussion is going to be led by our amazing panel, which includes Jordaniel Wong from Mauritius, Tuisina Imania Brown from Samoa, Rituparna Bora from India, Nadira Mazimova from Kyrgyzstan, Robert Akoto Amoafo from Ghana, and we also hope to have Laura Beltran from Colombia join the panel a bit later. So, to start this discussion and tell us a little bit about the report that was presented at the General Assembly yesterday, I invite Victor to share a bit.
Thank you so much, Leah. I hope that you can hear me well. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It's for me such a joy and an honor to be joining this very distinguished group of panelists. I so look forward to hearing from you, and also to share with you, this is my last speaking engagement as independent expert, so this is very fitting that I should be surrounded by persons who have been contributing and supporting the mandate in so many ways. So thank you so much. The discussion today, of course, relates to one of the topics that I believe the mandate was very much invited to explore when I began my consultations with human rights defenders and civil society activists. I think that one of the concerns when this mandate was created was voiced quietly but persuasively by a number of organizations, particularly from sub-Saharan Africa, who were concerned that the mandate was going to be put at the service of some forms of respectability, perhaps favoring fights for same-sex marriage, of particular forms of families, or particular forms of access to power. And I remember very clearly that throughout the consultations, part of the invitation that I was really made to me was to actually look deep into root causes of violence and discrimination, and among them, of course, getting to the point of speaking about colonialism and its lasting impact in all of the frameworks in which we carry out our life is a fundamental part of the queries that we have carried out. To me, what was really important is that we needed to get there after a work of building a series of concepts, so to speak, the building blocks of the legal theory behind the mandate, which we did, of course, in relation to legal language concerning legal recognition of gender identity and criminalization, and eventually getting to the very, very important and very crucial topics of religion and colonialism. This report examines, in fact, a very, very specific series of patterns. It's a way of, in a way, a case study, because we recognize, of course, that the term colonialism is used in daily and political language in very ample ways that designate not only the control of one state through one state over other, or a territory over other, but also very much processes through which groups or other types of entities actually subjugate others through expressions that can be even called economic colonialism, ideological colonialism, and so on and so forth. Now, the report actually examines a very specific set of colonial processes through which legislation was used as a main driver of, quote unquote, building a certain normality in relation to a notion of gender. Now, this notion of gender, constructed with very strong points of reference in the male-female binary, and all of the asymmetries of power that are associated with it. Now, what to me was important also in recognizing in this report is also that those points of reference in the male-female binary are not only the language of injustice that has been actually presented to the work of human rights defenders over the last 75 years since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, but also it's the key in which many of the rights and frameworks of protection are actually constructed. So we are in the dilemma situation of actually being confronted with criminalizing provisions that are deeply, of course, discriminatory and resulting of colonizing process, but also frameworks of protection that are themselves actually quite based on colonial notions that were used to actually subjugate peoples. The evidence base of the report, I'm not going to actually go into all of the richness. The beauty of this is that it's all published in the website of the mandate. And I would just wish that some of you, first of all, thank all of you who contributed to the report, and then just mention that there are so many examples that we have that create already a persuasive evidence base that before colonization, many peoples, ancestral people, indigenous peoples, pre-colonial peoples of sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, that they had notions of gender that were fluid, that did not have binary approaches to gender, and that did not necessarily correlate anatomy with gender identity. And the way in which morality was differently understood in pre-colonial societies and hierarchical constructions were made in different societies are part of the very, very rich base of construction of this report. What we know from these case studies that related mostly to the last, I would say, 5 centuries, and in particular Eurocentric colonialism, is that these colonial projects, very much related also to capitalistic enterprises, were particularly successful in concretizing political strategies that enshrined and used political homophobia, lesbophobia, transphobia as means of ensuring the colonial enterprise, which was essentially an economic endeavor. And of course, this continues because the defense of the colonial process is nowadays actually seen in the defense of criminalization that is now portrayed as being part of a set of quote unquote traditional values that we are very clear are not other than those imposed by colonialism. My report has formulated a series of recommendations to state and non-state stakeholders, the most important of which, I think, around which all of the other ones around is the fact that there should be a vigorous discussion by states and non-state actors alike of the responsibilities under international law of colonialism and the legal, educational, medical, and other types of structures that were enshrined in systems as way of ensuring subjugation, and exercises to question legislation and other structures that were creating through those processes. I'm going to stop here. I so look forward to hearing from the magnificent panel that you have put together. And Leah, thank you so much for your introduction, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you as well. We are extremely honored to have you here for your last speaking engagement in the position. But I think you've made some really interesting points, I think especially about the way protection frameworks are inherently flawed. In Trinidad, we are making some strides around anti-discrimination legislation, but still refuse to include SOGI as a grounds of protection. I think, in Trinidad and in the rest of the Caribbean, so I'm based in the Caribbean, we are still doing that work of dismantling those laws and dismantling those systems of understanding sex and gender that is rooted, as you're saying, in control and in oppression. I think thankfully we are moving away from that. Between 2016 and 2022, as your report mentions, about 5 Caribbean countries have decriminalized same-sex relationships. And I think we are moving away from those colonial frameworks. So in that context, I'd like to invite our panel to this discussion. And I want to ask really those same 2 questions. How have you, in your context, experienced colonialism, but also experienced decolonization as it relates to SOGI, as it relates to human rights? And the second question is, has there been any movement away from those colonial frameworks? Do you have any recommendations for us moving away from decolonial frameworks in the future? To start the discussion, I will invite our panelists from Mauritius, Jean-Daniel Wong. Welcome.
Thank you, everyone, and hopefully you can hear me properly. So Mauritius basically was a colony of British until 1968, and definitely colonization has had an impact on the shaping up of Mauritian society. For example, the legal system here is composed of the Code Napoleon, which is a legacy from the French colonization. And as well, of course, we do have a British part as well in our legal system. And that is very pertinent because 23 days ago, the Supreme Court of Mauritius, the highest jurisdiction in the country, declared that the Section 250 penalizing sodomy, the act of sodomy, was unconstitutional and discriminatory towards a gay male person. So now that the state of Mauritius has not made any appeal or an extension of a delay, so we can now say this is a huge step toward decolonization. Come to think that we are in a process when it comes to SOGI SC. We will be using that, what we call the ASIC versus the state judgment, because it is the very first time since discrimination is cited in our legal framework. Ever since 2008, one of a few things that take Mauritius to be a progressive nation was as well to take sexual orientation basis when it comes to discrimination, where we did have an equal opportunity at accessing public services, where you cannot be denied any service based on your sexual orientation. And the same applies when it comes to the workplace with the Workers' Rights Act, which has been enacted in 2008 as well, with a sexual orientation basis where you cannot suffer from discrimination in the workplace. And there is as well an equal opportunity tribunal which has been set up, but it encompasses sexual orientation. So basically now that we are looking forward to have the transgender recognition as well as a civil status, we will be using that ASIC versus the state of Mauritius judgment for the discriminatory part of it and the unconstitutionality as well. And the same will apply when we will be advocating politically for same-sex civil union recognition. And the events that have happened post of judgment, and as well the collective Arc-en-Ciel has been having its Pride March last Saturday. Unfortunately, after Pride March, at another event which was not legally connected. We were not connected. There were extremists from a certain group, a Muslim group in Mauritius, which is 17.3% of the population. So we did some, we will have to term it terrorism because people's been traumatized at a concert where they did a mix up of pride that morning. We did a mix up with the Section 250 judgment. And in Port Louis, capital, unfortunately, the constituencies of Mauritius being such, and this is another legacy from colonization, where out of the 4 constituency in the capital, 2 of them are strongly inhabited by the Muslim community. So basically, all political leaders, all contestants to elections will be very careful when it comes to be elected. So now that we've had attacks, and fortunately there were no casualties, no human casualty, but the message is clear from that extremist group that if they are not heard, if we don't abide by what they are saying, they will definitely come to attack on human beings. And they mix up things as well. Come to think of what is happening in Palestine, in Gaza region. So Mauritius have a social fabric that is where we have to tread carefully, but we still are moving forward, as we can say, because we can still talk to our political leaders, to the government as well, and to give our input when it comes to improving our legal framework, which, like I said earlier, is basically a colonial legacy. When it comes as well to SOGI SC as well, nowadays with 2.0 tools, with internet as well as, there are much scope to be able to change society's perception as well. This is the main thing that is kind of difficult in this country. But with the Section 250 judgment, we are confident that it is an open door now to bring forward changes and getting us away from the colonization and the legacy that we still kind of hold on in our legal framework and in our political system.
Thank you so much, Jean-Daniel. And I think you've touched on something that is relevant to all of us on the chat and on the panel, that really entrenched legislative system. One of the mechanisms, as mentioned in the report, of colonialism, unfortunately, one of the more powerful and long-lasting mechanisms. I'd like to invite our second panelist, Tuisina Imania Brown, to also answer those questions. But I'm also going to ask you, Tuisina, we've got a question asking, how do we hold colonial powers accountable in this decolonialization process? So I'm going to give it over to you, Tuisina.
Thank you very much. And I just want to echo Leah's comments, Victor. Amazing time in your mandate. Thank you so much for flying the flag for all of us and for actually being the voice for the voiceless at the United Nations. It touches me knowing that you've done great by the LGBTI community. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. 2 questions I'm going to ask, and then Leah, you can throw me the 3rd question and I'll respond. How have experiences of colonialism and decolonization impacted human rights advances in your own context? So here's a few things to think about. Colonialism's impact. Colonialism in the Pacific disrupted indigenous acceptance of gender diversity in Samoa, in Tonga, and in every country in the Pacific. Western values and norms were imposed, affecting the role and status of Fa'afafine and Fa'atama in Samoa. We were parts of families, respected with a Fa'asinomanga or a specific role to play. The most serious offender of colonialism? Faith, because faith produced morality. It introduced morality. It introduced sins, right? And isn't it funny how it's the priests from one particular denomination that have been at the center of immoral acts against children for years? Funny that. Colonial legacy. The discriminatory laws that are very ripe in our community and we're trying to decriminalize, anti-sodomy legislation, female personation laws, these were all spiced up and juiced up with faith, right? It led to societal prejudices, and the many gods that we had before they came were replaced by one omnipotent God. And it gave birth to the offsprings of discrimination, violence, exclusion against Fa'afafine and Fa'atama. It was very disruptive to Samoan and Tongan society, including Fiji, Cook Islands, Vanuatu, Tahiti, Hawaii, all 26 countries in the Pacific. There is a name for people like me. But now, you know, with the evil and immoral sinners from faith, you know, we need to be reformed. We need to be converted. The other thing I want to mention around this colonialism is pronouns. So please don't be offended by this. I get accused as a trans woman of color often for being transphobic if I don't use the right pronouns to call somebody they, them instead of he, him, right? Mark my words, there are 6 official languages of the United Nations and nearly 7,000 languages in the world, and each one of those languages has pronouns. So let's not get agitated about it, because unless you learn every single one of those languages and their pronouns, all you're doing by accusing me of being transphobic is you're perpetuating language supremacy and deploying it to hijack social justice movements. Come to Samoa. Come to the Pacific with your he, him, she, her, they, them pronouns, and I will welcome you with the 25 different pronouns we have in my indigenous communities. And if you care about mine, I'll care about yours. So decolonization and positive change. Look, this for me is the unweaving of introduced fibers into our daily lives. The laws, the norms, the vilification and the persecution. That is what decolonization is for us. Dismantling colonial era prejudices and discriminatory laws, unpicking it from the very fabric of our traditional communities and society. And every time we pick at a foreign strand, our resilience goes up. Our courage goes up. Our bond with community is made stronger. Our home becomes safer. Decolonization, right? Decolonization is not just about decriminalization. Decolonization is at its very core, is we, the indigenous identities of Pacifica, Asia, Africa, Latin America, Caribbean, saying, no, we do not need to be fixed or cleansed or decolonized. We were perfect as we were within our communities, villages, and families. Now, the second question is, what opportunities and recommendations for the future do I see by embracing a decolonial framework? Opportunities, reclaiming our indigenous identities. Decolonization means we reclaim and celebrate indigenous gender identities and sexual orientations, such as Fa'afafine and Fa'atama. We're looking at a cultural resurgence. A decolonial framework allows for the resurgence of indigenous cultures, traditions, and values. Greater acceptance of diverse gender expressions and sexual orientations, our ainga, our family, our extended families versus nuclear families. You know, our culture. Currently, there's a debate in the trans community, right, in the West. You've only dealt with binary, the 2 genders, you know. You're only now starting to argue about whether there's possibly more. You know what's happening in Pacific, in Latino, in Asian cultures? We've had 4+ genders for a millennia, including roles in traditional religious ceremonies. Go figure. You know, human rights advancements. Decolonization equals advancing human rights for indigenous LGBT individuals, but not everything old is necessarily good. Modern medicine, technology, women's rights, LGBTI rights, climate justice, HIV medication. You know, it has taken a long time, but we are slowly getting there in terms of advancements. My final thing, recommendations, legal reforms. Please advocate for the repeal of colonial era discriminatory laws and the implementation of inclusive, indigenous informed legal frameworks. But wait, do it in a culturally appropriate manner that follows the principle of do no harm. Don't you be rushing to the Pacific saying decriminalize, decriminalize, decriminalize. No, you have to talk to us who live in the Pacific. Cultural education, please promote education and awareness of indigenous cultures, including our historically inclusive stance on gender and sexuality. Did someone say the current trans movement issues? We as Pacific, as I said, you know, plus indigenous, trans and gender diverse populations can step in and show Western turfs how we roll. Let us front the arguments. Introduce us, you know. Weaving. This is something that, Victor and I have spoken about many times. Recognize that we as LGBTIQ are at the core of the intersections of identity, who we are and how we self-identify, and gender, multiple genders, and sexuality, how we swing, ethnicities and culture. Cherish that role, print it, live it, and own your identity. And social acceptance, we do this, we do all of these things. You try and take these bite sizes of wisdom, I guarantee you will be elated and elevated and enlightened in your understanding of diverse gender and sexual identities within the context of Indigenous cultures, pushing up prejudices, violence, and discrimination. Thank you. That was my little piece that I wanted to share.
Thank you, Tuisina. And I just want to ask, one of the questions we've got in the chat is, should we hold colonial powers accountable to be part of that decolonialization process? Do we, require them to pay reparations, or should we ask them to, how do we ask them to be more accountable for making that change away from colonial frameworks?
Absolutely. Somebody should knock on the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom's door at 10 Downing Street and say, buddy, your colonial laws is responsible for criminalization around the world. There are 68 countries that still criminalize homosexuality. There are 11 countries that still have the capital punishment for our people. Our people could die from these laws. Knock on the UK PM's door and say, give us some money, roll it around to all the countries that still criminalize. The other thing is, knock on Antonio Guterres' door, the UN. Make it, and I've said this before, make it a legal obligation to join the United Nations, that you have to follow the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Make it a legal obligation. If you're going to have these laws against my people, don't become a part of the UN. Get the fuck out. Seriously, you have no right practicing in the United Nations space if you violate these laws against my people. Of course, we have to hold them accountable. That's the thing. But we build slowly. We're building our power base. We have amazing people like Victor, who are mandate holders. We've got, it's going to be done. Maybe not in our time frame, but look, we're standing on shoulders of giants who were here before us. One day we will be the giants, and people will stand on our shoulders. Do you understand? That's how we push back as a movement. In indigenous societies, that's how we climb up the coconut tree, on people's shoulders. Do you understand? Sorry.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's very important for us to understand the passion with which, we're doing this work. And, it really is something, I think, that affects all of us on the work that we do in a very real way. Thank you. I want to invite Ritu Parna from India to speak a little bit to these same two questions. How have you seen colonialism as well as decolonization manifesting in human rights advances in your country, and recommendations for moving away from those colonial frameworks?
Yes, thank you for this report, Victor, and also thank you for having me. And also, as my where I stand as a lesbian woman, I'm also an Indian woman, but also I'm an indigenous woman from the Northeast. So I take various stands when I am speaking about what colonialism has done to India, and also to me as an indigenous lesbian woman. So while talking about colonialism and SOGI, we also have to talk about the idea of nation, nationalism, and gender, and not just binary gender, but also what kind of woman and men was expected to fight the colonial rule, right? Educated, and someone who was moral and who was good, and who are not caretakers, and able-bodied and married, of course, but also someone who can then rightfully fight the others, the colonial. And in this entire fight against the Britishers, we actually forgot the lower caste woman. We actually forgot who were the wet nurses who were actually taking care of basically the nationalist leaders who were fighting the Britishers. So English education became mandatory, while the lower caste women were taking care of the households of the nationalist leaders who were upper caste people. Caste is the big issue here. Similarly, and therefore when Victor talks about morality of the good, good survivor, of the good person here, and it becomes very important in our fight for actually the LGBT rights discourse also here now, because as a indigenous woman coming from the Northeast, I was much away from the mainstream discourse of, you know, what is sexual norms, what sexual norms are accepted in the mainstream India and what sexual norms are not accepted in mainstream India. For example, I come from an indigenous tribal culture where marriage is not necessary, you can live in, and our cultural society would actually decide whether you actually get married or not. My own cousin got married at the age of 58, legally and socially. Legally it was required because his own son wanted to get married. So and I asked my father, what if he was not married legally? And then my father said the villagers would have taken care of the partner. And then comes the whole idea of rights. You know, Westerners, the colonials gave us right. And then the legal framework of how do we separate property? How do we, who do we get rights? How do we get cards? How do we get, ID cards made? Because for many queer and trans persons to be recognized as citizens of this country, it is so difficult to get those ID cards made, because we know that in our country, forced marriage is a reality. And for that, many LBQ women and trans persons are forcefully getting married, and they're not being recognized in the society, and then they are not getting those shares of the property. So now comes capitalism. Now who is a good victim? Now capitalism comes in, and then you fight for funding. Now the Britishers, now the colonials' rules of divide and rule policies work excellently. Now it's basically like, who is a good victim? Give us a good victim card and you play the victim card well. And that's what the colonizing, it's not the colonizers did, the colonizing theory of how to rule. Actually, this is what the government and the capitalism is also doing. The second thing is that Victor also mentions about hijras. You know, hijra woman, the Khwaja Sarais and Kama Sutra, which we always hear about India. You know, India has had a golden past. India had such a lovely past. We also have heard about Mughal India, where we had the Sufi culture, where we had people, men singing for men, love poems. But sometimes I am scared. And in India also, we had a culture where, still in many places, men holding hands are not seen as, gay men. The more the rights language came in, the more visibility of LGBT came in, the more the separation of men from public spaces went away. Visibilization is important at some point of time to get rights, but to what extent is important? It is something that we need to understand. But again, exoticization of indigenous and our culture is also not so nice, because did we have a golden past? We don't know. Hijra women and Khwaja Sarais were respected. I don't know if they were respected. They came in with those kings to be the guards of women, because they were apparently harmless and they would not have sex with those 10,000 women whom the king married. And the king basically made sure to send cut vegetables to those women's chamber, so that a woman would also not masturbate. Because the Khwaja Sarai or the hijras or the castrated people will not be a threat to the woman. That was thought about. Did they have right to form a family? Did they have sexual rights? We don't know, because history is his story. We don't know who has written those stories. But also, as I was saying, exoticization of our culture is not nice. But as someone from the indigenous culture, as I saw the previous speaker was saying, learn from us. Because the fact that our culture is messy, our culture is so diverse, we can also teach you how rights can align with our culture without exotizing it, and also without actually saying that, like whenever someone meets me from outside, they say namaste. And namaste, I don't say namaste. Like, really. I'm from other part of the country where I don't say namaste. So this whole exoticization of quote unquote one culture, one divine culture, it is not true. So I think people should learn about diversity, which was practiced, but also not romanticize saying that we had a golden past, but also align the rights, but not rights, because rights will have layers, rights will have so many other things. Now it's happening with the marriage equality petition. Everyone wants marriage without understanding that chosen family, extended family, where hijra gharanas have been living for ages, is now they forgot about the fact that that's how we have been living as a community. Now just everyone wants one couple marriage equality framework from the West. So this is what I have to say about colonialization. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rituparna. And I think you've made some amazing points. I see, yes, folks giving us the fingers, spirit fingers. You've made some amazing points about the cultural superimposition that the report talks about as well, and the erasure of our more expansive and nuanced local traditions. I think that is something we've experienced in a lot of different regions as well. I want to invite our next speaker to speak to those same questions, Laura Beltran from Colombia.
Hola a todos, voy a hablar en español. You could put the translation for the session. So, yo quiero resaltar la manera en que el colonialismo ha estado y está todavía en el centro del conflicto armado que vivimos en Colombia. Y es porque, bueno, para el informe y la contribución que hacíamos para el informe de colonialismo de Víctor, estábamos viendo, bueno, las prácticas trans y homosexuales eran de hecho propias de la forma de sociedad de las comunidades indígenas antes de que vinieran los españoles. Y entonces esta forma de pensar que las personas LGBT somos indeseables es una forma colonial de pensar, ¿no? Y es la forma, la discriminación, es lo que ha hecho que los actores armados pues violenten a las personas LGBT en Colombia, en zonas de conflicto sobre todo, y hagan que tengan menos derechos que los que normalmente las personas LGBT tenemos en todos los contextos. Entonces, por ejemplo, para la construcción de paz, es importante resaltarlo. La Comisión de la Verdad colombiana escribió sobre esto y dijo, la discriminación contra las personas LGBT tiene que ver con un pensamiento colonial, así que no nos pertenece, digamos, desde el principio. Y creo que hay que resaltarlo también y que es útil para los procesos de construcción de paz actuales, en el sentido de que nos permite también tejer como puentes con otras comunidades, ¿no? Que también están subordinadas, subalternizadas en el marco del conflicto. Por ejemplo, aparte de lo de la Comisión de la Verdad, estamos construyendo el primer Plan Nacional de Mujeres, Paz y Seguridad en Colombia, y allí estamos construyendo los puentes con las mujeres indígenas, con las mujeres afro, y estamos identificando cómo podemos, por ejemplo, trabajar en que las comunidades indígenas no expulsen a las personas LGBT que están con ellas y puedan brindarles protección o apoyo en el marco de este conflicto armado. Entonces, creo que hablar de colonialismo no tiene que ver solo con hablar de lo que pasó, sino como hablar cómo opera y cómo podemos usarlo para entender lo que está pasando hoy y para mejorar la forma en que construimos paz. Definitivamente entender lo colonial que hay en la discriminación contra las personas LGBT nos ayuda a tejer este tipo de puentes para construir una paz realmente más inclusiva en mi país. Y creo que estamos avanzando hacia ese lugar. También es importante como que estemos viendo siempre el colonialismo no creo que solo está en el centro del conflicto armado colombiano, sino y en lo que viven las personas LGBT en el marco del conflicto armado colombiano, sino en lo que viven las personas LGBT en todas las guerras. Pues obviamente todas las personas, todas las guerras tienen que ver con cómo funciona hoy el colonialismo, pero cómo el colonialismo hace que seamos personas que tienen impactos muy exacerbados en el marco de los conflictos armados. Entonces, bueno, la invitación desde Colombia también es eso, de que reconocer el sustrato colonialista de la discriminación contra las personas LGBT nos sirva para construir políticas de paz más inclusivas y que realmente sea pues la apuesta queer interseccional de la que siempre hablamos. Ah, ¿tengo que acabar? No, están 10 minutos. Entonces, en Colombia, reconocer que, por ejemplo, había una comunidad en el Caribe cuyas prácticas era que al quinto hijo ya la iban a criar y a tratar socialmente como una mujer. Por ejemplo, que es lo que rastreamos para el informe del colonialismo de Víctor, nos ayuda internamente también a poder como enseñar a la gente que la agenda de los derechos LGBT no es una agenda como que nos impusieron, ¿no? Que viene de afuera, del norte global, sino que es nuestra agenda y que también tiene que ver con lo que nosotros somos. Y eso es como muy importante, por eso creo que este informe es tan importante, porque creo que da la posibilidad de especificar en todos nuestros países cómo lo colonial es precisamente pensar que las personas LGBT somos como una agenda del norte global que vino, como dicen y han dicho muchas veces los políticos, digamos, de derecha de mi país, como que vino a contagiar a todo el mundo. Y es como, no, no, no. Nosotros existimos con orgullo desde hace mucho tiempo y poder decirle a la gente como puntualmente cuáles eran esas prácticas, está ayudando a transformar la visión y también está haciendo mejores alianzas para la construcción de paz. Entonces, gracias por poner la lupa sobre estos temas, porque son actuales, son vigentes y nos ayudan a tener mejores políticas. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Laura, and 100% agreed. I think part of why this report is so important, it allows us to reclaim, as you're saying, that LGBT agenda as something not Western, but something local and rooted in our own traditions. I want to next invite Nadira Masimova from Kyrgyzstan to share on these same two questions.
Hi, everyone. So thank you for inviting and organizing the webinar. I work at ECOM. We operate in Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, and Central Asia. And I would like to share some context of the region. There is a strong narrative that LGBTQI are a Western propaganda. However, homophobia, transphobia are products of a colonization. In Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, there is still criminalization of consensual sexual relationships between adult men. Those laws are legacy of Soviet Union. There was a question, should we hold colonial power accountable? So our colonial power is Russia, and Russia has no guilt and no shame of bringing those laws to the region. Moreover, after full-scale invasion that Russia committed in Ukraine, the influence of that state is growing. We can see that in the beginning of the year in Georgia, the foreign agent law was initiated. The Ministry of Finance of Kazakhstan published the register of foreign agents for the first time. Anti-LGBT propaganda law was signed by the president in Kyrgyzstan, and this law is like the same that exists in Russia. Just a couple of days ago, in my country, the foreign agent law passed first reading. If the law comes into force, people can be imprisoned up to 10 years. In 2022, in Uzbekistan, we have registered 80 cases of hate crimes against queer people and 5 sentenced because of homosexuality. However, UN World Tourist Organization called Samarkand, Uzbek city, a world tourist capital in 2023. The 25th session of UNWTO General Assembly took place in October. Before that, Uzbek authorities conducted mass cleansing of queer people in Samarkand. At least 8 trans women were persecuted by police. The registration to the event was closed. The government tried to hide all queer issues during UNWTO General Assembly. Who will take responsibility of those queer people who were arrested? Who will take responsibility of harassment against queer tourists who decided to visit Samarkand after the promotion that was conducted by UNWTO? The colonial approach should be framed by grassroots local organization, saying, oh, we shouldn't raise LGBTI issues in Central Asia because there is a difficult culture context. There is not a decolonial approach. Human rights are universal, leave no one behind, right? So homophobia is not our culture. Transphobia doesn't run in our blood. Therefore, we need real solidarity from international community. We need to bring attention to Central Asia, and we need international community to ask accountability from our governments. Creating a space for a discussion like this one, making analysis, report that was conducted by the Special Rapporteur Office is a great starting point, and we really appreciate for that work. So my biggest recommendation is to actively urge Uzbekistan to abandon the criminalization of homosexuality, or at least impose a moratorium. Kyrgyzstan should not pass foreign agent law. So there is a momentum. Soviet Union collapsed more than 30 years ago. A new generation was raised in independent republics. There is a generation that is proud of our diversities, of our identities. We don't have power yet, but we have our voices. Please listen to them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadira. And 100% I stand with your message of solidarity. I think it's really the only way we can really bring the resources together to make change and fight against this very, pervasive colonial systems. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to invite Robert to share as well on these 2 questions.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Great. Thank you so much. And because of time, I would not go very deep. I'm Robert from Pan-Africa ILGA, and I'm excited to join this. Victor, thank you so much for this report. For us in Africa, we cannot say thank you enough because we have an issue of documentation. Our history is oral. And so most of these things that we do not have some of these research and information to back up what we want to say. And the people who are against us today are using the fact that we don't have data, we don't have information. And so these things are a very key thing for us when we have information that we can use. Now to the question of how does it affect us? First, colonization has affected the way we see ourselves as Africans. And the reason why I say that is that even before the colonialists came, we're looking at ourselves as people who love one another. We don't create danger for anybody. But once they introduce their laws and their ideologies, now it's made people look at other people to identify the good and the bad through the eyes of the colonialists. And this is what makes people identify queer people as wrong people who do not belong to the society that we already have. Now they introduce the Bible, they introduce all sorts of things that now redefine what good and bad is. What we used to know as good and bad is taken away from us. Secondly, it affects the way we think. Now if you talk to anybody, I want to share the story around. My partner called me one time to say, Robert, I'm in class and I'm teaching my pupils, and this is something that I'm reading to my people from a book that we are having. The book says the role of the woman is to satisfy the man sexually. I mean, this is what is in books for students in schools. How will a student who is studying this think about themselves as a woman, as a man, as a person? Think about themselves. They will think in these boxes, and these are children who are being taught that the role of the woman is to satisfy a man. And this is coming from books, from colonial ways of education. How we used to educate ourselves, the past and our history tells us, was through teaching love, teaching attention, teaching unity, bringing us together and showing us our tradition and how we are supposed to respect one another. But no, this time, the colonialist agenda around ensuring that we box ourselves into certain spaces so they can take advantage of these things. I want to draw attention to one key thing around the recolonization that is happening. Why do I say recolonization? The idea of the anti-gender movement using these things back again to our people to say, look, this is your African value through the eyes of the Bible, saying that we need to define the African family value. You know, now within the African Commission, I just from there and from Tanzania, where activists, we are looking at the idea that the anti-gender movements are thinking about and supporting the African Commission to come out with something they call the Charter on African Values. And this is what they are going to use to guide what decisions, what the commission that is on human rights should look at when they are deciding what African values are. And this is something that will continue to push this colonization agenda on us as a people. What can we do? First of all, we need to look in our educational systems. We need to see how we can advocate to change, because wherever you are talking about education, even if you talk about in churches, it is what the pastors are educating our people about, and forgetting our African traditional values and seeing them as rather the wrong ones and preaching them as the blood-sucking, the spiritual wrong thing, and rather pushing the white-looking angels to us. And so it's important that we clear our minds through education of our people. Secondly, even amongst us development partners and as people who work, in our way of working, let's avoid the savior syndrome, okay? If we are supporting one another and working with one another, don't let us come from the West thinking, oh, we are coming to save these people. They are being told to be gay and they are being beaten and killed. No. Work with the community members from the community in Africa, in Asia, in the Pacific, in the Caribbean, as the people with their own voices, so that people will stop saying that it is an African value, it is a Western value that we are pushing on them. If Africans are speaking for themselves in the space of the community, the people will know that it is Africans who are saying that this is who we are and this is what we are saying. But if we keep on pushing this agenda of a savior syndrome, coming to tell our African leaders that this is wrong, that is when they'll continually see our sexuality and our gender identity as a Western value, but not an African or Asian value or Pacific value. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Robert. I think you're absolutely spot on about what is essentially a recolonization project that is going on right now. And Laura spoke as well to that colonization agenda, what is essentially a colonization agenda that we need to address. And mindful of the time and mindful of this being Victor's last official speaking engagement as independent expert, I invite you, Victor, to share any brief closing remarks with us as we end off today's session.
Thank you so much, Leah. And thank you, dear colleagues around the panel. It's been a joy to listen to all of you. It's a humbling experience, as it has been for the last 6 years, to actually learn so much from the persons who are actually having the knowledge. And let me that be the first of 3 words that I want to try to add, not to summarize, but to add to whatever has been said. The first one is, I was delighted when the South African delegate yesterday, when I presented the report, asked me a question about decolonization of knowledge. I was not able to do it justice because, you know, in the third committee, you're rushing through, you know, seconds and seconds of work, of time. But what he meant, and I was talking to him afterwards, was the very way we conceptualize and value knowledge is colonial and recolonial. For example, what gets paid in terms of development work? What gets recognized? My great call that I think is based very much on a questioning of dismantling these structures is that our movement, which has gained so much knowledge, needs to review the way in which knowledge is actually valued, understood, managed in the system as well. I recently said, I have seen far too many people losing control of their life story when it's used for purposes which might be very laudable, but we always need to recognize that people remain the owners of their life story. Second, I've seen too much knowledge of organizations lost and extracted for the purposes of actually carrying out that notion that Rituparna so beautifully put, the notion of who is a good victim and how that is valued and appreciated. And I think that that's the first great call is that reconceptualization of what has value. And of course, it is a challenging of the whole notion of capitalism and what gets valued in capitalism constructions themselves, which of course I think we should be brave enough to actually raise and carry out within this reflection of these spaces of research and of discussion concerning the impact of criminalization. The second word that I would like to add is there's an importance in understanding how decolonization also must mean indigenizing existing categorizations that we use as analytical frameworks. We need analytical frameworks because analytical frameworks are necessary for political advocacy. So we cannot do without them, but they need to be indigenized. And I think Imania beautifully put it. Okay, you know, come with the two pronouns. I'm gonna counter with 25. And this is by no means challenging. It's adding the enormous richness that we all have to contribute to a human conversation. So it doesn't mean that we need to eliminate the wonderful acronym that has served us so well, but we need to understand that it doesn't include everyone. I've often said that my mandate was crafted through work of genius. Many of you in this call are to thank for that. I didn't have anything to do with it, in that it made allusion to sexual orientation and gender identity rather than LGBT. And that has allowed me to cast a wide net and to include persons who inclusively do not identify themselves as belonging to those communities or populations and yet are suffering victimization. So creating space for the emergence of geographically and culturally specific linguistic terms that embody strong cultural context and are considered more connected to the lived experience of gender and sexually diverse persons, that cultivate space for the international stage for development, elevation, and promotion of human rights relating to indigenous gender and sexuality diversity. And there, I think, very importantly, we need to support inclusive interpretations of international human rights instruments, and there the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is particularly important. And my last word in relation to that, dear friends and dear colleagues, our work permeates around the whole human rights work of the United Nations and this connectivity with indigenous peoples. What this report attempts to do, and I thank you for your kind words. You know, you never know with reports whether they're going to be well received or not. You put them out with great trepidation. So thank you for your kind words. One of the issues that this report was actually attempting to do was to provide legal and political language that permits inserting this as a priority work of the United Nations. Decolonization is a principal objective of the United Nations. And our quest is within decolonization a key element. Decolonization will not have been carried out as long as colonial legislation and frameworks are in place when they are harming, discriminating, and creating violence against persons. So I think that this report provides that grounding in Article 73 of the Charter, and I hope that it's taken up within the fora of discussion of the United Nations as a way to ensure that this dialogue is no longer not had by the nations that are defending this criminalizing legislation, which, as I said yesterday, is then in itself a defense of the colonial project, just in a new incarnation. And dear colleagues, my love, my respect, and my solidarity goes to you. Thank you so much for inviting me, and we will see each other soon.
On that note, I want to say a huge thank you to Isina, Rituparna, Nadira, Jean-Daniel, Laura, Robert, and everyone who's joined us and hung on for the extra 10 minutes. Thank you for being part of this really important discussion. Thank you, Victor, for the report, and I wish everyone a lovely day.